Today, I want to talk about something that didn't happen yesterday or last week, but this very morning, because at exactly 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the United States Navy began enforcing what is being described as a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. And while headlines make this sound simple, the reality underneath is far more dangerous, starting with one critical fact. At the exact moment this blockade began, Chinese ships were already inside the strait, already past the entry point, and operating under arrangements with Iran, carrying oil, cargo, and goods tied directly to China's economic lifelines. And to understand why that matters, you need to realize the Strait of Hormuz is not just a road you can block, but a narrow choke point only about 33 kilometers wide, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil flows every day, meaning any disruption there affects the entire global economy. And just weeks ago, Iran didn't physically block ships, but instead made the passage dangerous with mines and threats, which drove prices up. And now the United States is applying a similar strategy in reverse by creating a credible threat rather than a physical wall. But here's where things get complicated because Iran didn't close the strait to everyone. It allowed countries like China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan to continue passing through while restricting Western access. And now this new blockade flips that dynamic by targeting all ships connected to Iranian ports, including Chinese vessels, which means this is no longer just about Iran, but about China, because the United States is effectively placing itself between China and a critical part of its energy supply, forcing China into a decision it didn't want to make, either back down and allow its ships to be stopped, which risks damaging its global credibility, or push back and potentially escort its vessels, bringing Chinese and American naval forces into the same narrow corridor at the same time, which creates what can be described as a cascade problem where one decision triggers another until the situation escalates beyond original intentions. And this is especially sensitive because China is not officially at war and has carefully positioned itself just outside the conflict while still benefiting economically and diplomatically. But a direct challenge to its ships is public and visible and therefore harder to ignore. And what makes this even more striking is how quickly events unfolded. Because just days earlier, negotiations were taking place in Islamabad, where representatives were reportedly close to an agreement, with Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi indicating they were inches away from a deal before talks broke down and escalation followed almost immediately, raising serious questions about whether increased pressure will actually change Iran's position, given that it has already endured significant military and economic strain without backing down. And beyond Iran, the impact spreads outward because hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors from multiple countries are currently in the Persian Gulf facing increased risk, while countries like Iraq, that depend heavily on this route for both oil exports and food imports, are caught in the middle, despite not being direct participants in the conflict. And at the same time, Iran is expanding its diplomatic efforts toward Europe, engaging countries like Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, which introduces another layer of complexity since Europe has its own energy concerns and may not fully align with the blockade strategy, meaning this move could unintentionally push Iran closer to alternative alliances rather than isolating it. And at the center of all of this remains China, with long-term agreements, heavy reliance on Iranian oil, and ships already positioned inside the strait, a placement that appears deliberate because being present in the system increases leverage and raises the stakes of any enforcement action. And while China is unlikely to respond immediately with military force, it is almost certain to apply pressure through diplomatic and economic channels, turning this into a broader geopolitical contest rather than a contained regional issue. And history shows that blockades rarely work exactly as intended because they create ripple effects that extend far beyond their initial targets, increasing risk, uncertainty, and economic disruption, while often impacting ordinary people more than governments, which is why what happened this morning is not just a tactical move, but a structural shift whose consequences are only beginning to unfold, making the real question not what just happened, but what happens next.